This is the Italian Real Estate Podcast, here to help you with the ins and outs and basics of Italian real estate, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Hello there, and welcome to another edition of the Italian Real Estate Podcast, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Of course, we are back here again with Marco Permuni, an Italian attorney. How are you doing today?
Good, how are you?
I am doing great, thank you. And in this episode, we wanted to talk a little bit about the Italian notary. We've done episodes on the notary before in Italy, but in previous episodes, we've spoken about what is the notary and what are their responsibilities within Italian society and how it differs from the US and some other countries. But in this episode, we wanted to talk specifically about how does the appointment with the notary go. So Marco, just to kind of maybe give us a little bit of a recap on some of what we've spoken about so far. Of course, for people who are interested in more information, they can go check out older episodes where we've talked about this topic. But can you give us a little bit of an overview of what the notary is and what the notary does?
Thank you. So as you said, the episode will be about the actual appointment with the notary, because a lot of people, they don't know that there is going to be an appointment with the notary where the seller and the buyer will have to go in person. So it's not that you can deal with the notary through email, through the mail, or via telephone, video call. You normally have to go to the notary's office, both of the parties, the seller and the buyer. So it's almost a ritual. And that's why it's very important to know what's going to happen there, who you need to bring, who can attend the appointment with you, what documents you need to bring, and so on. But let me take a step back and answer your question. And of course, to clarify, I said that the seller and the buyer, they do need to attend this appointment, but both parties, they can actually authorize somebody else to go on their behalf. And if you're using ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com and if you live abroad, of course, we are going to be attending that appointment for you if you give us power of attorney. But let me take a step back and answer your question, Raphael, regarding who the notary is. So the notary in Italy is a public official, somebody who went to law school and somebody who went to the notary school. So after completing law school, there is an additional number of years of school to become a notary. And of course, there is a test that is very complicated that a notary needs to pass before they can become notary and exercise their duties. And also there is a limited number of notaries in the country, so per region. So not everybody can become a notary. You can only become a notary if you go to law school, if you go to the notary school, if you pass the test, and if there are positions available. Now the notary is, like I just said, a public official, so their duty with regard to real estate transactions is to certify the transaction, but not only that. So their purpose is not only to certify the identity, for example, of the people who are part of this transaction or their signatures, but also to make sure that the transaction is done in compliance with the law and to make sure that all parties understand what's happening. So in other words, the notary is not there just to certify the identity of the individuals that are going to be there at the appointment, like it happens in other countries where the purpose of the notary is simply to certify a signature and making sure that an individual is who they say they are. In Italy, they also need to make sure that whoever is present, meaning the seller, the buyer, potentially the bank, if it's the seller at a mortgage or real estate agents, that everybody understands what's going on and understand the content of the deed and understand the consequences of the deed. This is the reason why, for example, one of the things that happened during the meeting with the notary is that the notary reads out loud the entire deed and the parties only listen. So there will be a time during the appointment where the notary basically reads the whole document, the whole deed, even if it's a multi-page deed, to make sure that everybody hears the full content of the deed and that everybody agrees and understands the consequences of what's happening. Also, among the responsibilities of the notary, there are some other duties, including the duty to verify that the seller is the legitimate owner of the property, as well as the fact that the property that is being sold is compliant with the cadastral maps filed with the cadastral office in Italy, meaning that if there are irregularities between the actual status of the property that is being sold and the maps filed with the cadastral office, then it's the responsibility of the notary to verify that the seller has rectified those irregularities before the property is sold and the deed is signed.
Very interesting to hear about all of this, Marco. And just a question to move on. Who is the one that actually ends up choosing the notary, and how does that work?
That is a very good question. A lot of people, they ask themselves, should I choose? I'm the buyer. Should I choose? I'm the seller. Am I responsible for choosing? Should I choose a notary that is close to where I live, close to where the sellers live, close to where the property is located? Now, the rule is that the notary is normally chosen by the buyer because the buyer is the one that pays the bills. So that's why, generally speaking, the buyer is going to be choosing the notary unless it's otherwise agreed between the parties. Now, it's also very common to choose a notary that is located close to where the property is located, because that's generally convenient for both parties, but that's not necessarily the case, meaning that it doesn't necessarily mean that the notary needs to be in the same city or even region of where the property is located. So you could choose a notary that is even on the opposite side of the country if that's more convenient for you. So in conclusion, the notary, generally speaking, unless it's otherwise agreed, is chosen by the buyer.
And another quick question, when we're talking about choosing the notary, are the prices regulated? Are all the prices for every notary the same across the country? Or will you find differences between the prices of notaries across the board?
No, the fees are different. So it depends on the notary that you choose, which is why it's important to choose wisely, because notaries, they will apply ultimately different fees. Now, I will also say that, just to meet expectations, that the cost of a notary in Italy is not insignificant, especially compared to the cost of a notary in other countries like the US. And again, this increased cost has to do with the fact that the notary in Italy is a completely different professional from notaries that exist in other countries like the US. So what happens is that normally the buyer gets an estimate from the notary that includes the notary fees, so his compensation, as well as the taxes that are required to be paid, that the buyer is required to pay to purchase that property. And the notary will act as somebody who will be paying the taxes on behalf of the buyer, meaning that the buyer will need to pay the notary not only for their own service fees, but also they will need to pay for taxes that the notary will then pay on behalf of the buyer. That's what the law says. In Italy, the notary is somebody who has the ability, and that's normally what happens, the ability to pay property taxes, meaning the taxes that you have to pay in connection with the purchase of a property on behalf of the buyer. So the invoice that you will get from the notary will have basically two sections. One is regarding the notary fees, and the other one is regarding the property taxes that are to be paid by the buyer in connection with the purchase.
Well, very interesting. And so, Marco, to get a little bit more of an idea of what actually happens during the meeting itself, can you share with us a little bit more of what the meeting looks like? What documents do you need? What's going to be expected of you or of the person representing you? What would that all look like? And even for the person representing you, are there extra steps in the process that might be necessary?
So like I said before, we're talking about an actual meeting. So you, the seller or the buyer, will have to attend the meeting unless you send an attorney, in fact, somebody who has power of attorney. And again, the meeting happens in the office of the notary. And only the seller and the buyer are allowed to participate in the meeting unless there are other parties involved, like the bank. If the seller had a mortgage, for example, an attorney, if you are using somebody to sign on your behalf. So if you gave power of attorney to an attorney, or a real estate agent, if a real estate agent was involved in the transaction, they are allowed to attend the meeting with the notary. During the meeting, the notary will read the whole deed out loud, and if you don't agree with some parts of it, you need to speak out and request that changes are made. Of course, generally speaking, both the parties have seen the draft of the deed beforehand, so they can come prepared. But if you didn't, when the deed is read, if any changes are required, you should speak out while the notary is reading the deed. And then if the other party agrees with the changes, then the notary will make such changes on the spot. And if not, the meeting, of course, will need to be rescheduled for the parties to agree on the proposed changes. Regarding documents to be brought with you, of course, you will need to have your valid ID, meaning your Italian ID, identity card, or a passport if you don't have an ID. You will have to bring your fiscal code, your codice fiscale, which is absolutely necessary to perform a transaction like this. So if you didn't, you will have to apply for a tax code before you're able to sign the final deed of sale. There are other documents that might be necessary. For example, if you're using somebody else to sign on your behalf, that person will need to have the original power of attorney with them that will need to be shown to the notary before they're able to sign in your name and on your behalf. And also a very important document that needs to be brought to the meeting with the notary by the seller, and that needs to be handed over to the buyer, is the energy performance certificate, which needs to be again given in original to the buyer during the meeting with the notary. The buyer will also receive the keys of the apartment on that day, and the buyer will of course have to hand over the checks to the seller, which is generally done on the day of the meeting, meaning the seller will receive certified checks issued by an Italian bank during the meeting. It's more uncommon for the buyer to execute wire transfers beforehand, so in advance before the meeting, because that would mean paying for the property before you're actually the owner of the property. And since you become the legitimate owner exactly at the time of the meeting when the deed is signed, that's normally the time for the buyer to hand over the check rather than paying through wire transfer in advance. However, lately notaries, they have started to implement systems where they accept wire transfers from buyers, especially foreign buyers that don't have the chance to get a cashier's check from an Italian bank. So in these kind of situations, normally notaries accept payments in advance that they will just retain in their escrow account and release to the buyer only at the time of the meeting. So exactly when the deed is being signed and the keys are given, in that exact moment, then the notary will basically wire the funds to the seller.
And so, Marco, we've been talking about this deed and this very important factor, of course, of buying a home in Italy. When does it take effect? Is that something that needs some time before the person will actually take ownership, or do they actually own the property as of the time of the meeting?
The buyer will own the property, will become the legitimate owner of the property as of the time of the meeting, as soon as both parties sign the deed and the keys are received. Normally, the buyer leaves the office of the notary with a temporary certificate of ownership, because the notary has 15 days to register and record and file the deed with the proper Italian public offices. And after that time frame, you will also receive, or you can pick up from the notary's office, the registered deed, which includes all of the information regarding the purchase.
Very interesting. And just to get back to the meeting itself, how long should a person expect to spend in the notary's office? Is this something that takes a long time to get done?
Generally speaking, you can expect the meeting to take between 30 and 60 minutes, depending on the case.
Oh, so that's not bad at all. But that is, I think, going to be a great place to round out the episode. So, of course, thank you so much, Mr. Marco Permunian from ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. If anybody is looking to purchase property in Italy and is looking for help along the way, how can they get in contact with you and your team?
People can contact us through our website, ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com, or give us a call. Our number is on the website.
Absolutely fantastic. And of course, if you're interested in more discussions about purchasing property, renting property, or where to do so in Italy, be sure you are subscribed to this YouTube channel as well as the audio-only podcast. But of course, if you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, that means you're also automatically subscribed to the Italian Citizenship Podcast, where we talk about how to legally live in the borders of Italy. And of course, if you're interested in more about life abroad and living abroad, be sure to come over to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Rafael Di Furia, where I talk about the experiences of being a dual citizen expat living abroad. Of course, we have been here with Mr. Marco Permunian. As I mentioned before, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there. And we will see you all next time for the next episode of the Italian Real Estate Podcast. Later.
Thank you.